Good afternoon. My professors, Professor Kofi Agau, Professor Bode Omojola, colleagues online and here present, I welcome you all to this first keynote presentation by Professor Bode Omojola. It is great honor and immense joy to read the recitation of Professor Bode Omojola. While I take the recitation, I want you to rise as I read the profile of Professor Bode Omojola. Thank you. Bode Omojola is the Hammond-Douglass Five College Professor of Music. As a Five College Professor, he holds a joint appointment with all 5 institutions of the Five College Consortium, Amherst, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke and Smith colleges, and the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, USA. Omojola received his Ph.D. from the University of Leicester, England, and taught previously at the University of Ilorin in Nigeria and Northeastern University in Boston, USA. His research focuses on the music of Africa and the African diaspora, ranging from indigenous to contemporary traditions, as well as the works of Neo-African composers of art, music. He has held prestigious academic appointments, including the Radcliffe Fellowship in Musicology at the Harvard University, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellowship at the University of Cologne, Germany, and the African Humanities Fellowship Program in the African music hosted jointly by the University of Ghana and Northwestern University. In the 2019, he was awarded the Meribeth E. Cameron Faculty Award in acknowledgement of his exemplary scholarship. Omojola combines scholarly work with composition. His publications include numerous articles, reviews in peer-reviewed journals like Ethnomusicology, British Forum for Ethnomusicology, Journal of Popular Music Studies, Research in African Literatures, and Black Music Research Journal. His books include Yoruba Music in the 20th Century, Identity, Agency, and Performance Practice, by University of Rochester Press. Popular Music in Western Nigeria, Theme, Style, and Patronage, Institute Française de Rachel en Afrique, and Nigerian arts music with an introductory study of Ghanaian arts music. Omojola's compositions cover a variety of media, including piano, chamber music, choral works, and operas. His most recent opera, Funmilayo, is based on a libretto on the anti-colonial activism of Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, 1900 to 1978. The opera was premiered in April 2023 by the Mount Holyoke Symphony Orchestra, the Five College African Opera students, conducted by N.J. Tian Hill. I want every one of you to join me welcoming Professor Bode Omojola for the keynote presentation. You are welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Loco, for that beautiful introduction. I was wondering who you were talking about, because, so I'm just so very grateful for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I will try as much as possible to make sure none of you falls asleep after that heavy lunch. So I'm very excited to, first of all, to share the same stage with Professor Kofi Agawu, who is, I think, the greatest scholar of African music and one of the best scholars of any type of music. So please give him a round of applause. It's interesting because Professor Agawu is my friend, but my mentor as well. So I don't think I write anything that he doesn't read. It has to go to him first. And so any mistake that I make today, you know where it's coming from? I have to start by thanking the Chancellor, because you can imagine how this would have been impossible if we didn't have Professor Lukaya's support. So we are very grateful to how God has been using him to empower music education in Nigeria. It's all over the country. And I also have to thank Professor Ayolabi, the Vice Chancellor, who is getting used to the African time in the celebration of African art music. I like how he's always calm and he will just sit down there, be looking at his phone, So thank you. And then Professor O'Neill, the Dean, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Bayo Oyemi, who was a senior to my wife at the College of Education in Elisha many years ago. So my wife said, greet Brother Bayo when you get to Nigeria. And I would like us to to stand up and thank Dr. Ayorinde for making this possible. He's a marvelous young man. He's so, Ayo and I are talking and I say, Ayo, so, you should send an email by Tuesday. He said, I've sent it. I said, I've not finished the instructions, very hardworking. And I think he's achieving all this because he has people in this department who are supporting him, empowering him, and open to progress, to experimentation. So let's also give a round of applause to the music department. So I will now start my keynote address. All those minutes that I've spent, please don't add it. So the narrative impulse in African art music: history, fiction, and symbol. So given the reference to my book, Nigerian Art Music, and its inspiration for this symposium, I thought it would be helpful to start my presentation by providing some background on the factors that led to its publication. As some of you may know, the book is a small section taken from my Ph.D. thesis at the University of Leicester in England. My original plan was to focus on a topic within the disciplines of historical or theoretical musicology as was practiced at that time. That plan was a logical follow-up to my bachelor's degree in music at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, where I majored in composition. I took pride in being a good pianist at Nsukka and cherished the fact that I was one of just a few people to major in composition. But toward the end of my first year at Leicester, I began to feel a sense of disconnect with everything around me. I think food had to do with it. First, I was the only African and one of about 3 black students in the music department. I started to feel like an outsider to Western classical music, the musical tradition I had proudly practiced and enjoyed in Nigeria. Although I still like classical music, even up until now, my sense of belonging as a practitioner of that canon began to diminish. Against this background of my ambivalence toward classical music, I went to my supervisor and said that I wanted to change my topic. So, which was how I ended up studying the works of Nigerian composers. So long before the trend for people advocating for an engagement, an inclusive approach to music research, I thought my thesis, which was submitted in the 80s, I didn't want to mention that so that you won't be calculating my age. At that time, I was already working on that intersection of disciplines. So I approached my supervisor and said I wanted to change my topic. In my interactions with Nigerian composers as part of that research, I realized they too had experienced a similar identity crisis at some point in their careers. Many of them after moving abroad. Because when you are here, you think, this is our music, Western classical music. But when you travel, then you realize you're actually an outsider. So in my interactions with the composers, I realized they had a similar crisis. And many of them, after they had moved abroad, because they realized the dislocated nature of their music education and needed to re-educate themselves. Ethnographic research became a key tool for narrowing the knowledge gap created by colonialist music pedagogy. Musical composition offers a way for them to confront the complex nature of their experiences. While colonialism has ended in nearly every part of Africa, its lingering effects continue to influence the work of composers, including those of you born in the post-colonial era, in ways that resemble the identity struggles faced by the composers that I discussed in the book Nigerian Art Music. This opening provides an important background for my discussion today, which explores how composers create their music as post-colonial subjects. It highlights the potential ambivalence of positionality and the conflict of identity that drive the compositional process, manifesting as contradictory impulses in the musical score. Today, I will focus on a few composers and works to illustrate how the musical and cultural experiences I've outlined above translate into musical narratives and how the conflicting expressions of the self and the other influence compositional goals and strategies. A key question I pose is how composers navigate the continuum, connecting the desire to narrate history with the urge to fictionalize experience, 2 primary impulses that propel creative work. But I must start with narrativity. What is narrativity? To begin with, I define narrativity as the expression of social experiences as stories. Musical narrativity denotes the inherent orientation of a musical performance to define the premises for measuring its efficacy based on the convention of practice to which it is affiliated, as gleaned by listeners and as activated by the creator of a performance composition. Such premises are both internal and external. As Richard Taruskin has observed, and I quote, "Narrating is not simply a tale, but a telling, and whoever or whatever is designed as a teller is a voice." Commenting on musical narrativity, Kofi Agawu has observed that, and I quote, "The idea that music has the capacity to narrate or to embody a narrative, or that we can impose a narrative account on the collective events of a musical composition, speaks not only to an intrinsic aspect of temporal structuring, but a basic need to understand succession coherently," End of quote. These observations remind us of the critical components of the narrative enterprise, namely, to use a statement by Gerard Prince, and I quote, the constituents of the narrated, that is, the what that is represented, those of the narrating, that is, the way in which the what is represented, and the principles regulating their modes of combination, end of quote. I would like to add to this that the cultural provenance of a narrative practice that provides the background for understanding how new variants of a narrative genre overlap with, deviate from, or revise its historically abstracted form. Abiola Irele draws attention to the multi-dimensional power of African oral narrative forms like Oriki. He describes narrativity as a process of, quote, reconstitution in which the elements of history interface with those of form. In other words, the narrative enterprise is motivated by two complementary impulses. The will to factualize, that is, to convey experience and history as factually as possible, and the will to fictionalize, that is, the creative retelling of a story. The factional and the fictional are, of course, not mutually exclusive, although a narrative expression may emphasize one over the other. Colonialism. The problem and the type of musical compositions, you can divide them into two from the perspective of the impact of colonialism. Many composers represent themselves as a reaction to the politics or impact of colonialism. At the center of the debates regarding the identity of African art music is the question of how to respond to colonialism, whether to affirm or retrieve indigenous African music as a radical response to the impact of colonialism, or accept the impact of colonialism in ways that reinvent Western and African elements as an expression of the reality of post-colonial life. In Ghana, for example, under the regime of Kwame Nkrumah in the early 60s, it was expressed as Sankofa, which is an Akan word that means going back to the roots. But while there is nothing wrong with going back to the roots, retrieval must engage with the logic of history, because social experiences are real and specific and are shaped in contemporaneous terms. Retrieval, quite often, I should add, is located in the semiotic realm of iconicity, the sign of similarity. The second approach, which is a pragmatic one, often thrives within contradictory spaces. As is often the case, it is defined by a different kind of political will, quite often to create a new musical impetus or language that reflects the impact of Europe. This means bringing together two different languages with contrasting syntactical rules of grammar and symbols. Of course, there is the third factor, which relates to the agency of the composer who creates the music. In the specific case of the African art composer, agency is often shaped by the experience of studying and practicing Western classical music in the church, in school, and so on and so forth. A logical question is, in what ways does bimusicality shape the musical personality and alter the perception of Africanity? No. Okay? The science of narrative. I will be mentioning words like iconicity, indexicality, and symbols, all of which refer to the phenomenon of meaning. I know there are a lot of young scholars and students here, so I will briefly explain these concepts. The focus here is on the theory of meaning as postulated by Charles Sanders Peirce, an American philosopher, about the relationship between a sign and the meaning that it generates. He identified three types of signs, namely icon, index, and symbol. Icons generate meanings through resemblance. So a picture of Bode Omojola, for example, there used to be one there, It's an iconic sign for Bode Omojola. You can see how this might work in a musical composition because it's like a kind of repetition. For example, a musical work at the level of language or style could seek to imitate another type of music. At the granular level within a piece, a musical phrase or a section that is repeated in other sections of the piece helps the listener to understand contrasting phrases or sections and therefore provide a basis for interpreting musical form. So it's like repetition. You know what repetition does to a musical piece. Index signifies through association based on experience or a natural phenomenon. One example that scholars often give is the one between smoke and fire. That is, smoke is indexical of fire, just like lightning goes with thunder. Agawu explains that, and I quote, indices exemplify secondness and are based on contiguity between sign and object. So if you haven't bought on African music, you have to buy that book. This one is from page 41 of that book. One African musical example of indexical relationship is the call and response, right? When you hear a call, then there should be a response. A call is often continuously linked to the chorus. Within the framework of functional harmony, a dominant chord at the cadential point is likely to go to one, right? So association. So you can see the link between iconic and indexical relationships and musical structure. Musical forms or any other type of narrative define themselves through repetition and variation. A composer could engage in a historical recreation, that is a factual recreation that is very close to its original, representing a form of iconicity. An example of this comes from Ghana, especially the Pan-African Orchestra, which was formed many years ago. In its exclusive use of indigenous African instruments, the Pan-African Orchestra, formed by Nana Danso Abiam in 1988, represented a unique development in the history of post-colonial art music in West Africa. Rejecting a Western-type symphonic idiom, the orchestra focused mainly on African instruments. The PAO uses original African instruments like the kora, like the gili, like the shakers, like the big bell, and so on and so forth. An example is a piece titled Adawura Castle, which is based on a traditional song of libation, which the PAO orchestra usually performs at the beginning of their concert. So let's listen to Adawura Casa. Yeah, I wanted us to hear the entire piece. That's the only piece we'll hear from the beginning to the end. So let's talk briefly about what we just heard. As you might have noticed, the performance features likely bell-driven ostinato versions of the West African standard pattern. Instrumental punctuations begin with a rattle as an initial signal of presence, followed by a more settled participation, as shown in the subsequent involvement of what sounds like a talking drum, followed by brass instruments, both of which suggest instrumental surrogacy. Drums and brass engage in some movements of imitation, with the latter translating rhythmic patterns into a form of parallel organum common in the indigenous performances. We can describe the essence of the music as an exploration of periodicity. We can, say that they range from recurring elements that establish a foundational framework to those that create a sense of unfolding through their staggered appearances. There is also the use of density through the reduction and expansion of musical texture as an organizing element. Density helps to identify the introduction while serving as a cadential device for closure. The piece stands as an iconic representation of indigenous West African music. So we could say that in the piece, creative adaptation is limited. There is a notable similarity between this performance and what we've had, in different parts of Africa we're all familiar with. There is a notable similarity, I just said that. Now, without properly contextualizing the piece, one might argue that the piece falls short of iconic ambitions. For instance, we heard tokenistic allusions to drum surrogacy and improvisation during the brief drum appearances, but there is no real improvisation. Thus, the music seems to imitate African traditional instrumental music in non-exploratory ways. But the moment we understand that this music is actually used as the opening for their concerts, that's the concerts by PAO, then we understand why there is no improvisation. So context is always very important. So, interpolated iconicity. So you'll be forced to listen to those of you who refuse to go and listen to my opera online, you will sit down and hear everything this afternoon. I'm kidding, just a little bit of it. But iconicity often functions complementarily with other strategies in a musical composition. This is illustrated in my opera titled Fumilayo. To start with, the opera is a narration of history based on the activism of Fumilayo Ransome Kuti. A key question I had to reflect on was about the type of music I needed to write to convey an historical event involving a prominent Nigerian elite who resisted British colonial rule in her country. I found a crucial answer in the conception of the opera's pitch resources. I realized that I would need to combine different pitch systems, namely atonality, tonality, Yoruba pentatonic practices, and the Yoruba oriki. In some sections of the opera, I use the medium of oriki in two ways. The first is to recall historical facts to weigh in on the narration of the plot. The second one is because oriki has an ambiguous pitch orientation. It helps to collapse and mediate the tension inherent in the juxtaposition of multiple pitch systems. This is illustrated in the abdication scene of the opera, where oriki complements in narrating the fate of one of the two protagonists of the opera, the king of Egbaland, who has to abdicate due to pressure from Fumilayo Ransome Kuti and Egba market women. As many of you know, Fumilayo Ransome Kuti led a group of market women to resist the colonial taxation policy that targeted women in particular. In the opera, the women believe that the king is a tool of the British. In the excerpt you are about to watch, the king realizes he has to abdicate after months of demonstration by the women. He knows his time is up and must abdicate. But the British colonial officer, for obvious reasons, does not want a king who has been faithful to the colonial agenda of Britain to abdicate. So let's listen to a section of the abdication song.
Understand why you would not wait any longer. The sight of turmoil and discontent you have therefore decided. Please reconsider your plans to go away. I have therefore decided to go. Please reconsider. I have therefore decided to go. Please reconsider. I have therefore decided. Please reconsider. I have therefore decided. Please reconsider. Go, go, to go away.
So I encourage the singers to choose their own notes, generating flexible parts that are set against a fixed and atonally directed orchestral accompaniment. Regarding the use of oriki here, history is implicated in two ways. On the one hand, the materiality of the narrative. The what that is narrated is historically cumulative, building on the heroic activity of the king's predecessors to reflect on the tragedy of these specific moments. Also, the form that is employed in the narration, separate from the historical information contained in the narration, is historically grounded and understood by those familiar with the Oruku genre. Its specific use here represents only one possible compositional rendering of the form. And of course, you had the narration supported by a solo cello and the Yoruba talking drum toward the end of the scene. Composition as a sign of community. The musical scoring of community life has attracted the interest of a number of African composers. One of the pioneers of this approach was Samuel Akpabot, as illustrated in his Ofala for a wind orchestra and 5 instruments, which he wrote in 1963. Conceived as a tone poem, the music is based on Ofala, the annual festival of the Igbo people of Onitsha, during which the king, that's the Igwe, gives an account of his stewardship to the people. The scoring of community has attracted younger Nigerian composers. For example, Onye Nwakpa and Avan Ikoku Nwamara. Nwamara's Nwanyi Akiti, which means granite hawker, for SATB and percussion, is set in the Igbo dialect of Abakaliki and accompanied by an Igbo instrumental ensemble recalling traditional practices. As Onye Nwakpa, who has studied that work, explains, the work recalls the enterprise of groundnut selling and the relational dynamics of seller and buyer. Nwakpa's Apulo Dokiari, I'm searching for oil, for SATB piano and percussion, focuses on the story of oil discovery among the Okrika Kalabari Igbo people in the Nigerian Delta. It narrates the mystery surrounding oil discovery and the environmental degradation that continues to mark its exploration. One of the more internationally visible composers whose music functions as a sign of indigenous communities is the Ugandan composer Justinian Tamusuza. The work of his that I want to discuss briefly today is the one titled Abafa Luli, which means those that died, which uses the European quintet instrumentation to represent a Ugandan community. The instruments are flute, an oboe, a clarinet in B flat, a horn in F, bassoon, and percussion. The principal theme on which the quintet is based is a song taken from Joseph Kiagambidwa's oratorio. So in other words, he uses a theme from that piece in this example. I don't know whether you can see. Can we go to these slides? Yeah, so that's the melody that is used in the piece. It's a fairly long theme. So as Tamusuza explained, his wind quintet is a minimalist piece, not in the sense of the American minimalist movement of the 1970s, but in the sense of the composer's traditional African Kiganda music culture and his personal expressions, which are a product of the Kiganda culture. So I just want to give you a sense of the score, because talking about multiple voices, these are like instrumental voices now of the music. Key elements of the composition include polymeter, layering, motivic economy, asymmetric phrasing. The composer also instructs all 5 players to blow the horn and bassoon to simulate the sound of the Buganda tuned drums. All this lend to the work a multi-vocality that helps to signal a Kigandan musical community. So let's listen to a part of that music. Thank you. So as you must have noticed, overlapping parts sometimes feature parallel contour outlining intervals that range from seconds to thirds to fifths, or their inversions. Also, an individual melodic material may be internally harmonic, like that horn melody that you're hearing. Despite all this, the organization of material in the piece is predominantly horizontal, and pitch centricities tend to be largely incidental, recalling what Sam Aquabot will refer to as involuntary counterpoints. This accounts for why other parameters like texture, motivic variation, and the engagement between the melodic and the rhythmic passages play significant roles in the unfoldment process of the piece. There is a pervading sense of a Ugandan modal and rhythmic stamp across the entire piece. You are listening to Western instruments, but you think you are hearing Ugandan instruments. It's like the biblical phrase about the voice of Jacob versus the hands of Esau. From a macro-structural point of view, the piece is informed by what I would like to refer to as a Ugandan multi-dimensional matrix, defined by melorhythmic polyphony and the periodicity linearity trope that we heard when we listened briefly to the Pan-African Orchestra. So, this is the last musical example. We've had that one. So we're going to South Africa now, to Bongani Ndudona Brin. As demonstrated in Abafaluli, the fictional and the factual are often interwoven in the creation of a work. The music of the South African composer, Bongani Ndudana Brin, illustrates this interface differently. I'm going to jump the history. For Ndudana Brin, embracing the theme of cultural nationalism as a composer does not amount to a rejection of European forms. Indeed, he finds such forms adaptable for forging his own style and creating music that interrogates South Africa's social and political issues. His opera, Winnie the Opera, which is set to a libretto by Mfundi Vunda, is, for example, conceived as a portrait opera that presents competing narratives about justice and reconciliation in South Africa, filtered through the anti-apartheid activism of Winnie Mandela. In the opera, the scene celebrates village life and traditional music practices that bring some relief within the tense and tragic narrative of the politics of South Africa. In the scene, Xhosa ceremonial music takes a center stage. Winnie shares her love about Nelson Mandela, and the people sing responsively with her as part of the Lobola wedding engagement. Bongani depicts the tranquility of a South African village in many ways. For example, through a shift from a heavy orchestra falls to a small number of percussion instruments. I think I have the notation. Yeah, I hope you can see that. Okay. As shown in that example, the scene opens with a soft, gentle sense of pulsation through layered melorhythmic and percussive patterns played by marimbas and the timpani. The bassoon provides a widely angular melody moderated by sustained notes. These, together with the sound of the cockerel, emphasize the composer's desire to represent the peaceful nature of a South African village. Instrumental painting is followed by a chorus of village women in playful and joyful dialogue with Winnie Mandela, who brings the news of her romance with Nelson Mandela. Highlights of the exchanges include repeating punctuations of the strings, modally conceived within a 7-note pitch collection with variable local elements like ululation, clapping, and a Winnie praising phrase, Halala Madikizela. If you look at the male chorus, you see intervals like the second, like the fourth, and the fifth, and the octaves, which sometimes merge into unisons, all of which serve to recall traditional Xhosa singing. I don't know whether you can see that example. But I think at this point, we should listen to some of these scenes that I'm talking about. So this music is coming from me this time around. I hope I don't mess it up. So it's going to be CD1. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. So that's what Bongani is trying to do there is paint a village scene. The creative, if I can get rid of this. Okay. So the creative insertion of indigenous Xhosa practices represents only one example of how Ndudana Brin represents Xhosa musical elements in the opera. In many other sections of the opera, he recalls Xhosa indigenous music through creative exploration of Xhosa modal scales. For example, the thematic material jamming out to structural development across the opera often employs one version or the other of the Xhosa hexatonic scales. A prominent example is the Winnie Mandela motif, which functions as a leitmotif for the character Winnie Mandela across the different sections of the opera. The largely horizontal approach to the organization of musical material often overshadows the significance of pitch centricities. Repetitive patterns, for example, in the form of ostinatos and their recurrences in different parts of the work, impart to many sections of the opera a pervading modal identity without necessarily articulating structurally significant centricities. There are hints of functionally sounding progression in the opera, the most significant of which is the approach leading to the end of the opera. In this scene, Archbishop Tutu urges the various political groups to embrace peace and reconciliation and forge a new South Africa. Winnie responds with an apology for the events that took place in Soweto, but without compromising the need for South Africans to be committed to the liberation of her people. She shouts, "Amandla, power!" And the chorus responds by shouting her name and saying, "Ungawethu, power belongs to us." The orchestra responds with what seems like a dominant tonic cadence, articulated by the bassoons, the cellos, and the double bass. I use the word seems because above that cadence, we hear the Winnie Mandela theme, which reminds us of the Kosa modal universe of the opera. So we're going to listen to the last musical example.
The question is mountain.
So now I'm going to go to my conclusions. We have listened to a relatively diverse set of compositions, right? These are compositional approaches. These include the Pan-African Orchestra's Adawura Casa that exemplifies the desire to retrieve or sustain indigenous traditions factually. Also, the conception of musical composition as a sign of a community, the deployment of an ancient vocal practice, oriki, within an experimental opera, and the creative interrogation of traditional pitch systems, or the use of multiple pitch organizational systems to narrate the activism of historical figures. There are many examples I didn't cover, like Showande's folk symphony that bear a very strong impact of 19th century European Romanticism, or the pioneering works of Ephraim Amu of Ghana, showcasing the musical navigation of the linguistic elements of tonal languages. The more recent Afrocentric or Afrosensitive works by composers like Charles Lwanga of Uganda, Nala Mata of Egypt, Genevieve Alote Papo, I hope I got that this time around, of Ghana, Christian Oyeji, Ayo Oloranti, Seun Owaige of Nigeria, and many others. It would be impossible to cover all composers in a 1-hour keynote. My overriding goal is to re-trigger, and I use that word because the question that I want to ask is perennial. We've been asking these questions for the past, 50 years. So I'm re-triggering a familiar but critical question. At what point are we going to be able to say that African art music exists as a distinctive language, perhaps comprising multiple dialects, with identifiable styles and discursive categories that provide the basis for interpretation on how to listen to the music? How should we hear the choral works of composers like Ikoli, Harcourt White of Nigeria, and Joshua Polumo Mohapelua of South Africa, in which the indexical relations that define Western tonal harmony are largely unfollowed, while traditional African elements bear new attributions of meaning? Are such innovative compositions one-off stylistic aberrations, or do they potentially constitute new patterns of style to be explored and developed by future composers? Talking about musical language brings me to the third category of signs that I didn't discuss. That's the one under symbol. Symbols function through linguistic definition in predictable ways and are socially agreed upon by their users. So this is the case, for example, with African languages like Igbo, Jukun, Kosa, Akan, and Ewe. Such languages operate in terms of how words and phrases that form the basis of their meanings are structured and indexically related, as well as the ideas and objects for which the words act as symbols. In musical terms, it means that we can enjoy a musical composition based on the music itself. That is, the ways the notes, the sounds relate to one another to make musical sense. How sections of a work are connected to one another, how chords function, how improvisation engages ostinato patterns, and so on. But musical performances also communicate referentially. For example, conveying emotions, alluding to social hierarchy, signifying political ideology, and functioning as a means of painting a community, like Tamosuza did in that piece. All these elements, internal and external modes of signification, and how we create or engage with them, take a life of their own when applied to post-colonial African music. Because of what? Because of colonialism. Because we must deal with how biculturally sourced material make meaning within entangled discourses linked to colonialism and as forged by individual composers. The reference to the role of the individual brings into focus how we define ourselves in relation to our environment and based on our experiences. Who do we consider ourselves to be as individuals? And how do we come to the decisions that we make when we express who we are musically? How do we as individuals narrate our experiences and express ourselves musically? And what are the factors that inform the musical choices that we make, for example, in terms of the musical material, the style that we employ, and our narrative strategies? Thomas Turino, drawing on, once again, Pierce, observes that there is a big difference between habits and expression of identity. Habits are the things we do every day. But identity are the things we want other people to see us. There are some kinds of music that I listen to when I'm alone. If Professor Gaud knocks on my door, I'll stop that music and start playing, I don't know, Schubert or Amu from Ghana. So habits, when we express ourselves, identity is about a strategic decision. This is how we want other people to see us. And there may be contradictions between our habits and how we represent ourselves, as I just said. The type of contradiction that I'm talking about is, for example, a composer who enjoys listening to Western tonal music. In fact, he or she is an organist who plays, Methodist hymnal every Sunday, and yet will not want to compose music that strongly depicts the impact of Western functional harmony, because such a person might not want to be seen as an archaic composer or one that is compositionally subservient to colonialism. The works that are created by such a composer could be said to emanate from strategic compositional decision. A composer could, for example, choose to write a modally configured composition animated by indigenous African rhythmic procedures rather than by European-type functional harmony. And that will represent only one stylistic template from a wider constellation of that composer's musical habits. As I have shown in this lecture, it's always about the politics of colonialism that will make a composer denounce a musical habit that she or he otherwise relishes in non-composing situations. Quite often, colonialism represents the mirror through which we see ourselves. One important point emerges from this. The process of selecting what and how we compose is often a debate between our inner self and the outer self. Something deep in you might say, let's use this particular style, while the other part might say, no, that will be considered too European. The inner-outer dualism, that is the self and the other, finds parallels in the Africa-Europe divide that colonialism created. But as most of the various examples show, post-colonial subjects live neither solely in the inner self nor in the outer self. Our African world is defined by the entanglement of the self and the other, the African and the Western. As composers, quite often we embody the contradictions that mark post-colonial life. Then you might be saying, okay, so which one does he prefer now? For me, the most successful composers are those who define themselves in terms of how and the extent to which they reinvent inherited musical linguistics with an impulse towards uncharted musical territories. The more creative a composer is reinventing the past, the more successful they will be in being faithful to their experience. In such works, retrieval will need to be filtered through the lens of new ideas of creativity and contextualized in ways that speak to the experiences of the composers. Of course, not all composers will follow this approach, and why should they? There will always be numerous and diverse approaches to how we handle acculturation and resistance as post-colonial composers. I would like to make the case, therefore, for a critical and eclectic mindset in thinking about the issue of language in African art music. This is more so because composition, always remember, is a personal experience. You're expressing your experience. The moment you are trying to do something just because people think that's what they should do, but you don't believe in it, you are being false to yourself. It lacks artistic truth. But this doesn't mean that anything goes. So it's not that, okay, I'll go and add Stravinsky and add it to something. And Omojola said, That's why I'm stressing the word being critical. A good composer must master the techniques relevant to their choices. You must understand the technique. And engage in self-questioning and self-debating to create works that convey your intent and experience as organically as possible. Thank you for listening to my keynote. Thank you. You know, when we went for lunch, I didn't finish my rice, so I can't.
Okay. I think we should let's meet and give Prof more rounds of applause, please. Thank you so much, Prof.